Hello everyone, and welcome to this next video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for nearly 11 years now. I sit within the standards, regulation and thought leadership part of the organisation, and my role is very broad to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. With over 130,000 members of RICS working worldwide, right across the property life cycle, and right across the different asset types of land, residential, commercial, alternative infrastructure. It's a very, very broad profession, and thus the opportunities and indeed some risks in terms of data and technology are a major piece for us as a professional body. And today I'm really pleased to have Rob Jackson join us from Asite, one of our tech partners. So Rob, do please come on board.
Hi, good morning, Andrew.
Good morning to you. Well, I always like to kind of start these discussions with actually not the bits and the bytes, but actually a bit of kind of the human input. So it'd be great to hear a bit of your backstory in terms of the sector and indeed the kind of origin and heritage of Asite as an organisation.
Yeah, okay, super. Yeah, look, Asite is a technology platform that has been serving the built environment now for over 20 years. Born out of London's tech city, but now grown into a global technology services company. The platform itself, the Asite platform, we've always had an approach whereby we want to connect up the stakeholders who are involved in the entire life cycle of a built asset. And so, very closely we've been following the various standards that help support that life cycle and how we manage that data. We're privately run, still independent, and we work with key stakeholders across the globe. Some of the largest projects in the world have been delivered using the Asite platform, right from concept design stage through to all the data you would require in information management for construction, and then flowing through to asset management. And I think that's one of the unique points of Asite, that we've had this approach whereby we want to drive collaboration. Okay, and to do that, we've had a mindset of open data sharing. We connect and integrate with other platforms and systems out there that our clients may be using. So it's not choose us or them. It's a case of we can help our customers connect up all of the good tools they may already be using, but all of the data on a built asset sits on one platform. That's the Asite platform. So that's providing that single source of truth, that golden thread, if you like, throughout the life cycle. So yeah, and I mean, my background, I've been with Asite now for just over 8 months. And prior to that, I was actually doing a lot of work with RICS.
Indeed, yeah.
And indeed, spending quite a bit of time on the standards that we'll be talking about today.
Indeed. Well, talking of standards, Rob, obviously, but what I wanted to really kind of focus on to start the conversation was the new International Building Operations Standard, which literally RICS released a couple of weeks ago now, which is very much looking at that operational cycle of building performance, but also particularly, I think, as you know, putting people at the center of real estate in terms of making sure that real estate not only delivers on cost management and sustainability issues, but that people piece as well. What's your sense of the need for IBOS and how it will affect stakeholders right across that asset life cycle?
Yeah, so I think IBOS couldn't come at a more opportune time, quite frankly. I mean, obviously, we've all experienced the last few years of COVID. And I think that's changed the mindset of a lot of us as to what sort of environment do we want to be working in. From the asset owners, what sort of environment and workplace do they need to be creating to maintain staff engagement, staff efficiencies, and retention of employees? So I think COVID's really shifted the way that people are thinking about the workplace and what they want from the workplace. And then, of course, we've read so much and hear so much over the last few years about sustainability. And, obviously since COP26, the targets, the net zero targets that governments are committing to means there needs to be a fundamental shift in terms of how we think about building and indeed managing our assets. And you know, I think we all hear about some of the generic metrics about how 40% of carbon emissions comes from our sector, the built environment, and you know, I think most people attribute or think that a large chunk of that comes from the construction phase, and indeed a significant chunk does. And it's estimated about a quarter of that probably comes from the construction phase of an asset, or indeed the manufacturing of the components and materials that are going into the asset. That leaves 3/4 of that 40% coming from assets that are built, operational. And you can read other statistics that sort of talk about, well, governments are making these commitments to 2050. And you will also read that about 75% of the assets that we see built today, I mean, maybe you can see many outside my window behind me, but about 75% of these assets will still be operational in 2050. Yet 75% of those assets are considered to be energy inefficient right now. So clearly a lot needs to be done between now and 2050 with this significant number of buildings that need to become more energy efficient. So I think with combination of COVID and the drive towards more sustainability in the built environment, this is absolutely driving the need for a standard like IBOS. So,
yeah, and so, sorry, carry on, Rob. Yeah.
No, up to you.
No, I was just going to comment that you know, I was talking to some asset managers in London City recently, and I think they've certainly been waking up to the fact that they're presented with a number of challenges around ensuring that the assets they have are attractive from a kind of regulatory point of view, that they can report on them, that they can also rent them out, that there may be some kind of restrictions on the ability to rent. But I think also a recognition that actually they're in danger of the extreme case of stranded assets that effectively will lose huge amounts of value. And as you say, whilst people can focus on new build, as you say, the majority of assets are already built out there. So I guess from your perspective, how do we deal with that long tail of assets that are already there, and how, for instance, can we use sensors? How can we integrate data on this long tail of existing assets that won't have necessarily been built to these very high level building codes?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly, I mean, this is the magnitude of the challenge, and you're quite right that we are starting to see now the current condition of buildings impact on the value of those buildings. Okay, so obviously buildings need to be leased out, they need to be occupied, but they also are going to need to be compliant with what will be, no doubt, increasing levels of regulation and standards moving forward. So yeah, absolutely, this is posing a huge challenge for asset owners, and of course we are then seeing that reflected by the investment community, whereby, you know, the investment in sustainable assets, you know, accounts for such a high proportion now of total investment in real estate. You know, are people really prepared to take the risk of investing in assets that are not deemed to be sustainable in the long run? So no, you're quite right, Andrew. I mean, such an amount of activity needs to happen in existing assets. But for me, the challenge therefore lies with, you know, the data on those assets. You know, what's in the building to start with? How can we even think about retrofitting a building before we understand, first of all, its utilization, and then we start to unpick the building and understand what's in it? What are the components? Yeah? How could we retrofit it? And all of that hinges back to data, acquisition of data about the actual physical asset itself, and then acquisition of data about how the asset is being used. You know, what we are seeing is clearly now a proliferation of tools and technologies that allow us to collect that data. And you know, a lot of buildings, you know, particularly newer ones, of course, may have that technology built with the smart sensors linking to, you know, building management systems. I think the challenge lies with obviously older buildings that will require both retrofitting, but also retrofitting with sensors to collect the operational data that we need to manage the building. Luckily, the sensor technology guys have been working on that, and now there's so many technologies out there and sensors that can be fitted quite simply, quite easily and retrospectively, that still then feeds the data back to data centers that we can read. So I think the technology is allowing us to capture the data. I think I would say now we're getting to a point where there's possibly too much data, and the challenges, and I think there was one that comes from FMI estimated that if you look at the life cycle of a project through construction and operational management, probably about 96% of the data that is actually acquired goes unused. And so I think this is where the role of technology companies such as Asite come in, that we have the ability to take that data, structure it, classify it in a way that we can then extract meaningful value. Okay, so that allows stakeholders across the industry to utilize that data, and start to make informed decisions. But what's been lacking is probably the standards. So it's okay having all the data and then being able to report it, but the useful data, but then are we looking at outputs in a like-for-like basis? Am I comparing the energy efficiency of one building on a like-for-like basis with the other? And this is where the real challenge lies if we're going to make informed decisions. And so again, I mean, this is where IBOS, I think, is going to play such a critical role in providing some guidance as to what to measure, how to report in a consistent way. And of course, whatever the stakeholder group is in the built environment, the ability to benchmark assets will become ever more prevalent. And again, it's therefore important that whatever your stakeholder group, you can benchmark on a like-for-like basis. You're comparing apples with apples when you're looking at different measures.
Yeah, no, and I guess, whilst people are still quite wedded, I think, to their kind of jurisdictional standards, things like IPMS for floor plate measurement, while it sounds quite prosaic, as you say, if you've got an international portfolio, you have to understand the kind of areas that underpin so many of those metrics, don't they, in terms of utilization and waste performance and energy performance. So I guess that reminds us about how some of these fundamental things are very important. I guess another area I'd like to get your view on is this whole area of the phrase that sometimes I think a bit misunderstood or misused in terms of being a digital twin. And obviously people can get, I think, a little bit perhaps put off the concept of some incredibly sophisticated digital twin, when actually perhaps it can be something much more prosaic in terms of having a sensible amount of data about an asset in a way that perhaps, yes, is visualized, but doesn't necessarily have to be perhaps the extreme versions that people see that they feel are perhaps out of their reach, particularly back to that discussion about existing assets. What's your view on what digital twins really mean, particularly once again for that long tail of existing buildings that perhaps weren't BIMmed in the first place, so we haven't even got a BIM model to start with?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the terminology digital twin is interpreted in many different ways by different stakeholders. I think, look, the role of the digital twin moving forwards will absolutely be pivotal in how we manage our buildings, and whether that's collecting data on existing older buildings and trying to build a digital twin from that, or indeed carrying through the BIM models as to what's being designed through the construction phase to then what's being built, therefore becomes the three-dimensional digital twin of the physical assets. The key is then that's just a three-dimensional replica, digital replica of the physical asset. How do we then take that three-dimensional digital twin into something that becomes usable, allows decisions, predictive decision making, etc., forward-looking decision making? And that's where you need to layer on top of the digital twin other sources of data. Okay, and that's from the sensors, from the measurement of people. All of these metrics then can be layered on when we start to then capture that data and layer it onto the three-dimensional twin of the physical assets. You can then start, and tapping in with the IOT, etc. We can then start to look at, well, how do we make decisions using that data? Can we start looking at predictive decision making? Yeah. Can we look at artificial intelligence to help us make decisions, yeah, in a very predictive way? And certainly that's ultimately where our sector is heading, and we're seeing examples of that right now. But I do think there's a bit of a misconception about what is a digital twin, and yeah, certainly the ability though to capture, you know, both the three-dimensional twin of the physical asset, but then to connect in real time data flow between the physical and the digital. That's where we're going to extract most value. I think the other thing, I mean, you mentioned the various standards, and again, I talked earlier about how the need for standards is critical for, you know, technology companies like Asite if we're going to help our customers manage data and report on a like-for-like basis and benchmark. And I think some of the standards that you touched on there are absolutely pivotal and still probably not widely enough adopted across the sector. I mean, the property measurement standard, you know, it sounds very basic, but how do we measure and report floor space or building sizes, footprints? You know, if we can't get that consistent, then a lot of these other metrics that we see within IBOS, you know, rely on expressing a number, a metric as a function of the space of the building, the floor plate or the size of the building. So if we can't get that basic measurement right, all of these other metrics that we're layering on top are meaningless. So I think it is important, and this is why, you know, Asite is a tech partner of RICS. You know, we're very keen to look at not just IBOS, but the suite of standards that absolutely interlink and work hand in hand, whether that's IPMS, the construction measurement standard, of course, ICMS, in all of its three phases. You know, clearly we're seeing now stakeholders understand that an asset they need to be looking at from a life cycle perspective and not just its component delivery parts and operational parts. And certainly that's now been addressed by ICMS, and of course, you know, the sustainability parameters. So what is the embodied carbon going into a building during its construction stage versus the energy performance of the building during operations? So I think all these standards absolutely interplay and are pivotal that they work together.
As you say, with the recent release of ICMS 3 taking carbon emissions, we now have that framework once again for collecting that data right across the cycle. I mean, are you also, from an Asite perspective, given your kind of integrated approach, you know, looking at standards like ISO 19650 from an asset management point of view? Because there are lots of standards out there. The challenge seems to be now getting the market to adopt them, and for people like yourselves, as you're doing, to support them within that single source of truth, as you say, that single view of an asset.
Yeah, look, very, very much so. And it ties in very much with the comment I made earlier that, you know, as the acquisition of data has become easier and less expensive, yeah, cheaper to acquire, and the storage of that data has become less expensive and easier to do, you know, that's led to this proliferation of data. And you know, what was needed and what the technology sector has needed is then a structure, a framework by which to manage our clients' information in a consistent, structured and methodical way. And of course, ISO 19650 was exactly established for that purpose. So for the built environment, across the life cycle of an asset, how is a client's information on that asset managed, structured, held? Which then means the ability to pull information from it is easy. People know where to go. Platforms know where to pull data from. Yeah, the whole thing works when you've got these fundamental standards in place.
I mean, Rob, we've kind of touched on a number of kind of drivers and themes already, but if you were to get your crystal ball out, what do you think? What do you think are the main trends going to be over the next, say, 5-10 years around how we build and manage assets? Because in theory, we should be learning all the time, and that feedback should be going back into the way we execute new builds and the way we manage and retrofit. So where do you think those major kind of trends are going to take us?
I think for me, Andrew, probably the two biggest trends are also requiring a mindset shift, okay? And the first one of those is to absolutely consider assets from an entire life cycle perspective. So, you know, I think now, and we're starting to see that. So we're starting to see developers, designers engage with facility managers, yeah, at concept design stage, and that's absolutely what's required, because obviously the input and insight from these stakeholders who will be managing the assets are so fundamentally required to be able to design the asset appropriately. So I think we are starting to see that recognition and move towards thinking of assets throughout their life cycle, and therefore what are all of the stakeholders that will be needing to input and will be involved in that life cycle. So I think that's number one. I think the second one then is, how do we get all those stakeholders to collaborate? And you know, I think we all recognise that, you know, for many years, far too long, the construction of an asset has been very fragmented in terms of what teams do what, and then how does that information flow through to the asset management stage. It has been fragmented, it's been quite contentious in the way it's being delivered, and therefore very inefficient. And I think, you know, you don't need to read a lot of the industry reports that sort of ranks our sector as being one of the poorest in terms of driving productivity increases, etc. So what we're starting to see in many parts of the world now is much more of a drive towards collaborative delivery, a much more partnering model. And we're starting to see that through the stakeholders who are delivering and managing assets. And we're also seeing it now in the technology sector. So again, I think if you go back 10, 15 years, a lot of the technologies that were created to support construction and asset management are what you would probably class as point solutions. They were there to deal with a particular task or work, but didn't really talk to each other across different life cycle stages or across different stakeholders. What we've now seen is a real shift towards, I guess, what you would class as more of a common data environment, so that different stakeholders are working off a single platform. And I think BIM obviously was probably one of the classic cases where we started to see that now. So multiple stakeholders working off a common data environment, one source of the truth. And I think that collaboration model, though, is now going one step further. And again, this has been something that Asite has been driving for quite some time. The fact that there are some very good point solutions out there, and we want to offer our customers an end-to-end experience and solution, why would we go and reinvent the wheel and try and replicate lots of these other solutions that are out there? Let's collaborate. And so I think we're seeing this shift from common data environment now approaches to what I'll call as ecosystem approaches, so that we're building a community of different solutions, but still sitting on a single platform so data can be pulled and pushed. And so that's probably one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing now. And again, that does require a mindset shift, because it does mean that we need to move towards open data sharing. And then how do we manage the safety and security of that? Well,
exactly.
That's an easier challenge, quite honestly. But yeah, those to me are probably the two biggest shifts that we will see.
And I suppose that the irony to some extent, Rob, is that the technology is somewhat ahead of the market in the sense that it's ready for the market to adopt. It's ready for the market to change its behaviours and to be more collaborative, as you say, both in terms of the software vendors and indeed the other stakeholders. So it's a classic example of this is around people changing their behaviours and outlook rather than necessarily us having to invent some wonderful technology, because there's plenty of tech out there, isn't there?
Yeah, it is, yeah. And it's a case of just basic information sharing about where the technology sector is versus the stakeholders who are living and breathing the construction, design and delivery and asset management. You know, we've had a few meetings recently where customers have come to us to say, well, look, over the years, we've been building up this technology stack to help us build and manage our assets. And quite frankly, now we're getting very confused because, you know, we don't know which platform to go to, which solution to go to. We've got to train our people on multiple tools. And, you know, this is where we're saying, well, actually, there is a solution, and that's in the form of the common data environments and platforms, such as Asite, that actually allow your teams to work off one platform, but access the data and information that's pulled in from all of these other multitude of solutions that you may be using. So it's not necessarily a case of replacing all those technologies, that they've invested in and integrate. It's a case of just how do we integrate them in?
And I suppose it is a broader point that the whole sector needs to mature to the extent that it needs to understand that there are huge benefits in sharing data and getting data in similar formats, so that data can flow around in a governed way, as you said, in terms of security and privacy. But there are such gains to sharing data between platforms and between stakeholders that we can't have that siloed approach anymore, can we?
No, and I think you'll see from many of the technology companies and many projects now where they have embraced the concept of open data sharing, collaborative delivery, using tools such as Asite. Then the return on investment, it's probably it's a strange metric in some ways, because a lot of stakeholders still focus on what is the cost of the technology, when in fact that's got to be inverted and say what are the cost savings that adopting this technology solution will create. And you can read numerous reports out there that just by having a fundamental basic document management system can save up to 4 to 5% of manpower costs, just in terms of efficiency. Then you layer on top of that all the other technical modules that are required to deliver and manage an asset, and all the cost savings that drives. You're talking significant percentage cost savings compared with what we're used to.
Indeed. Well, it's been fascinating to talk, and it's very valuable to hear your view of standards, which we obviously think are so key in terms of enabling so much of technology, because without these frameworks, we're going to have a myriad of different approaches, aren't we? So it's really key to have those standards embedded. So for today, thanks so much for taking the time to chat, Rob, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
Okay, you're welcome. Good speaking, Andrew. Thank you.